Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when gossip wasn't just frowned upon, it was literally disfiguring. Imagine cobbled streets under your sandaled feet, the distant clang of metal against stone, and that ever-present smell of olive oil, dust, and to many public baths. Ancient Rome might be legendary for its philosophers and aqueducts, but beneath that marble gloss lived a justice system that often leaned more towards spectacle than sanity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, post your location and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through a Roman alley, and ahead, a crowd gathers near a low stone wall. At first, it looks like laundry nailed to plaster, but no closer inspection reveals a row of shriveled, discolored noses. Human noses. Some still have tiny tufts of hair. Others have metal pins driven through the bridge. You re-witnessing the eerie remnants of one of ancient Rome's lesser-known punishments, mutilation for slander. See, gossip wasn't just annoying in ancient Rome, it was destabilizing. Whisper the wrong thing about a senator's wife or suggest a centurion was cheating at dice, and you risked far more than your reputation. Authorities sometimes ordered the offender's nose sliced clean off disfigurement as moral warning. Then came the wall nailing, ensuring the punishment became part of the urban landscape. You wouldn't forget your neighbor's nose when you passed it every morning on your way to the bakery. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or mostly ceremonial, meant more to threaten than enforce. Some believe only slaves or the very poor faced this level of humiliation. Others think it cropped up sporadically in times of political tension, as a fear tactic to keep loose tongues in check. It's not just noses. In particularly egregious cases, tongues were removed to those that tended to happen more behind palace doors, with a lot fewer spectators. Still, the Romans had a thing for symbolic mutilation. The body wasn't just flesh to them, it was a billboard of obedience or defiance. The act of nailing a severed nose to a wall, that's a message. It says, this is what happens when you weaponize words. Some accounts even mention ears joining the lineup. Imagine walking past that wall after an argument with your spouse. You'd probably just nod and smile from then on. But don't feel too smug. Even today, we cut people off socially or drag their name through the mud. Romans just took it literally, and then made sure everyone else saw it, too. A more fringe element of Roman punishments came with accusations of witchcraft or cursing, often levied against midwives, herbalists, or women who just knew too much. If someone was caught whispering incantations near a statue of Mars or carrying a suspicious poppy root, it could trigger a trial. Not a fair one, mind you. One odd consequence, nose removal again. Some thought the nose channeled breath, and by taking it away, you silenced a witch's spirit. Fringe theory, sure, but records do mention this kind of spiritual disarmament, and you know that Latin phrase, sub rosa under the rose. It's where we get our idea of off the record. But if you said something too spicy under the rose in ancient Rome, and it got out, well, you might find yourself under the knife. The irony is that Rome had strict libel laws on parchment, at least, but enforcement was fickle and often theatrical. You couldn't just say your neighbor was hoarding wine during a famine. You had to prove it. Otherwise, your own words could become your undoing. And if you're wondering, yes, there were times when the nose cutting wasn't fatal. Roman medicine, as gruesome as it was, could stop bleeding with hot irons and vinegar. You'd live, but you wouldn't want to show your face in the forum again. What's even more unsettling, people collected these things. There's a fringe theory again, debated by scholars, that some Roman households kept dried body parts as reminders of loyalty, justice, or vengeance, a warning preserved in salt and spite. Now imagine being a kid growing up in that city. You ask, "Papa, what's that on the wall?" And your father replies with the Roman equivalent of that "why we don't you talk badly about the governor, son." So here you are, ambling past those ancient walls in your sandals. The sun dips low behind terracotta roofs. The nose is stripped of cartilage, and colour just hang there in silence. A flock of pigeons bursts into flight, as if even they're uncomfortable. You reach up to scratch your own nose, suddenly very aware of how valuable it is. And as the city darkens and oil lamps flicker to life, the wall behind you stands quietly, a gruesome reminder that in ancient Rome, words really could cost you flesh. You shuffle down a dusty Roman street and catch a faint, acrid smell lingering in the air, something oddly familiar, though not particularly pleasant. It gets stronger the closer you move toward the Phalonica, the neighborhood laundry workshop, the scent, urine. Yes, you've stumbled into one of ancient Rome's most pungent paradoxes: public urination as taxable revenue, and laundry as a criminal risk. Emperor Vespasian, who ruled in the 1st century CE, wasn't known for extravagance, but he was known for squeezing every last coin from the empire. One of his more infamous policies involved collecting taxes on public urinals. Not just the act of peeing, but the pee itself. You see, human urine contains ammonia, which Roman fullers used as a powerful detergent for whitening tunics and togas. It helped strip grease and loosen grime from fabric. It also helped bleach linen, albeit while assaulting every nostril in the vicinity. So Vespasian taxed urine from public collection pots. He even quipped to his son, Titus, "Money doesn't stink," when Titus scoffed at the idea. That phrase pecunia non gallet still floats around today, a smirking reminder that cash is cash, no matter how foul its source. But the punishment part, that's where things get weirder. Let's say you were a fuller, one of those laundry workers, and you couldn't afford the tax. Maybe you skipped a few payments, or worse, maybe you were accused of watering down your client's garments or reusing soiled urine in the rinse. That's a crime, oddly specific and surprisingly serious. Some fullers caught cheating customers faced public floggings. Others were bound in iron collars with little bronze tags declaring their offense. Imagine dragging yourself through a market wearing a sign that says, "I reused public pee. I am ashamed." Historians still argue whether these punishments were regulated citywide or more often imposed by local magistrates trying to make a dramatic point. Some evidence suggests more elite client senators. Wealthy traders pushed for harsher punishments when their delicate linens came back less than dazzling. One disgruntled patrician even accused a fuller of breaking the whiteness of Rome, which sounds poetic, but probably just meant his toga looked like soup. But even the average Roman knew better than to mess with urine economics. Fullers had to register with guilds, maintain specific vats, and submit to inspections. There were laws forbidding laundry operations too close to temples or bakeries. No one wanted that stench mingling with sacred incense or fresh bread. And there were urine thieves. Yes, that's a job title we can retire. People who stole liquid waste from full collection pots and sold it to laundries out of town. If caught, they weren't just fined, they could be thrown into fetid vats as ironic punishment. You swiped urine, now you sit in it. One source mentions a particularly foul punishment forcing offenders to stand barefoot in a full piss vat for an entire day, nose level with their ill-gotten gains. Then there's the infamous Slosh Bucket Brigade labourers who transported urine from public latrines to the laundries in clay vessels. Some were free men, others enslaved, but all of them walked around splashed in what you hope was just ammonia. One misstep on the cobblestones and, well, there's no coming back from that sort of spill. Imagine explaining to your friends that you were demoted from sponge stick duty to bucket detail. Oof. If you're wondering whether people actually bathe after all this sometimes, bathhouses were common, but laundry workers weren't exactly welcome in elite pools. Their scent lingered, so did the stigma. Some fullers were forbidden from entering temples or theatres unless scrubbed by others. A few high-ranking priests even lobbied to have fullers banned from festivals because, according to one marble inscription, they soured the air of the gods. But the system was lucrative. Rome was obsessed with clean clothes, clean in colour, not necessarily clean in smell, and urine was central to that image. Vespasian's tax became a permanent fixture, even after his death. In fact, some latrine tax collectors became wealthy enough to buy property. There is a mildly hilarious record of a former urine vendor buying a villa near Pompeii, probably the only Roman with a literal golden shower on his resume. A quirkier twist, urine wasn't just for laundry. Some Romans used it in tooth whitening paste. Yes, that smell on someone's breath wasn't garlic, it was part of their morning routine. You'd brush with imported Portuguese urine, rinse with mint, and head off to court looking like 1,000,000 denarii. And while we're on the subject of bodily fluids and punishments, there was another strange law. You couldn't mark the wrong statue. If someone caught you relieving yourself on a statue of a god or emperor, you risked losing more than a fine. One poor fellow, perhaps too drunk, perhaps too bold, was flogged and sentenced to carry a chamber pot around his neck for a month. Kind of a wearable warning. This man cannot aim. There were even attempts to ban nighttime urination near temples, enforced by guards who patrolled with lanterns and, unfortunately, whips. Late night relief gone wrong could end with a morning flogging and a brief appearance in the local court. All of this reminds you that for the Romans, purity was political. Clean clothes meant respectability. Filthy practices, especially unpaid or misused ones, meant chaos. So they punished even minor infractions with a flair that felt both theatrical and deeply unhygienic. You step out of the alley, your sandals mercifully dry. The air clears a little, though the faint aroma of ammonia still clings to your tunic. Somewhere behind you, a fuller rinses another toga in a vat that's seen better days and probably worse decades. You make a mental note. If someone ever offers to brighten your clothes Roman style, just say no. Your steps carry you deeper into the maze of ancient Rome, past the bustle of merchants, past the grumbling baker arguing over flour weights, and finally towards something quiet. That's strange. Silence in Rome usually means either a religious ritual or something far less sacred. You round a corner and find a lone man, stripped down, scrolls tied to his ankles like ragged streamers. He walks slowly, barefoot, each step making the scrolls bounce and twist. People jeer. A few children throw crumbs. You've stumbled upon a peculiar punishment reserved for intellectuals, the Scroll-Smuggler's shame parade. In a world that worships Cicero and Livy, you'd think knowledge was sacred. But ancient Rome also feared it, especially the wrong knowledge. Banned texts, unauthorized philosophies, or foreign poisons from Alexandria or Athens were dangerous. The Senate didn't take kindly to ideas that questioned Rome's gods, Rome's values, or Rome's emperors. And so, Book smuggling wasn't just frowned upon, it was theatricalized. This man you see, he was likely caught importing prescribed writings, maybe about Eastern mysticism, or maybe an early Christian scroll, or just a banned treatise on tax evasion. His sentence: public humiliation, not flogged, not exiled, worse, made to carry the very thing he loved in the most degrading way possible. Some scrolls were even glued to the body with sap, or stitched to skin. When they were removed later, well, let's just say they weren't returned to the library in mint condition. Historians still argue whether this was an actual legal penalty or an unofficial punishment carried out by zealot mobs or palace guards with too much time. The line between state-sanctioned and socially tolerated was, as usual in Rome, a little blurry. The records are fragmented, like the scrolls themselves. Sometimes the scrolls were burnt after the parade. Sometimes they were rebanned, ceremonially dipped in sewage, and left at crossroads. The point wasn't to simply destroy the information, it was to shame the carrier. Let every citizen know that ideas, when not properly sanctioned, could walk you into ruin. Oddly, the same era saw emperors hoarding books on poisons, astrology, and forbidden love spells. Tiberius had a hidden archive. Caligula supposedly read banned erotic poetry, allowed at banquets. Hypocrisy, naturally. But when they do it, it's collection. When you do it, it's sedition. You pause to watch the Scroll-Smuggler shuffle past, head down. A woman spits at his feet. He flinches, but keeps moving. His toes are raw. One of the scrolls flaps open, revealing faded script in Greek likely unreadable to half the crowd. But it's the symbol that matters. To possess words without permission was an offense against Roman order. Some fringe punishments for intellectual offenses included being book-starved. The condemned would be denied all reading and writing materials, even wax tablets. In one case, a philosopher caught lecturing on non-approved ethics was sentenced to a month in total silence. Guards were ordered to strike him every time he opened his mouth. He reportedly emerged fluent in blinking. Another tale, possibly apocryphal, involves a scribe whose ink was replaced with fish oil as a prank by guards. He didn't notice until the text he was copying smudged beyond recognition. His punishment: forced to memorize 1,000 lines of Virgil before being allowed near a quill again. You find yourself wondering how they enforced such literary laws. Turns out, there were scroll inspectors, appointed censors, who reviewed shipments arriving from Egypt or Greece. They'd open scrolls, skim for dangerous phrases, and even sniff the parchment for suspicious aging or tampering. One overzealous inspector reportedly banned a shipment of plays because he found too many metaphors. Too much suggestion leads to too much thinking, he warned. Sounds like a great party guest. And yes, black market scribes existed. If you wanted a banned poem or lost tract on Etruscan fertility rituals, someone in the Subura district would whisper a price. The punishment, if caught: these shadow copyists were sometimes tattooed on the forehead with the word plagiary is thief. Not just a label, but a lifelong brand. One poor soul reportedly begged for exile instead, claiming the shame would drive him madder than any dessert. Rome's obsession with control over thought extended to schools. Teachers were watched, scrolls were audited. Some scholars were required to submit lecture outlines in advance and early. Bureaucratic syllabus of safe ideas. Deviate too far, and you might be reassigned to teaching numeracy to toddlers. Or worse, made to read Cicero's lesser-known speeches out loud, to chickens. That last one might be satire, but honestly, who can say? And yet, books survived. Smuggled scrolls were hidden in clay jars, behind fake walls, or buried in cisterns. Sometimes the very people who arrested you would secretly ask to borrow your copy. Rome was as much a city of contradictions as it was of columns. The man ahead finally collapses. A guard approaches, not with sympathy, but with a scroll case. He begins rewrapping the damp, dirty texts. One of the guards tuts and says, "Still worth more than him." They haul the prisoner away not to be killed, just forgotten. As you move past the scene, you spot a child picking up a torn bit of parchment. He doesn't understand the words, but he stares at them like they matter. Maybe that's the real reason scroll smuggling was punished so oddly, because Rome feared not just the ideas in books, but the idea that someone else might care about them. You step over the scattered papers. The breeze flips one like a lazy butterfly. You don't look back. You wander into a quieter part of the city now, where marble villas throw long, slanting shadows over the cobblestones. This is the district of the respectable lawyers, retired generals, the sort of citizens who correct your grammar before correcting your manners. But even here, where order is prized and dignity is mandatory, bizarre punishments wait in the wings. Just a single wardrobe choice or left-handed scribble away. Yes, you've entered the realm where being too colourful or too left-handed could ruin your week. Let's start with purple, not the dusty kind you see on grapes or dried flowers. No, we're talking about Tyrian purple, a rare dye made from the crushed glands of murex sea snails. It took tens of thousands of snails to produce a single ounce, and the result was a hue so rich, so vivid, it became a political statement. Under Roman law, only emperors, or those they explicitly permitted, could wear it. Even a trim of Tyrian purple on your tunic could land you in serious trouble, and by serious trouble, we mean punishment ranging from steep fines to the very public humiliation of having your garment burned in the forum, while you stood there, watching it smolder like your social status. One especially unlucky merchant who dared to commission a full purple toga for a wedding was sentenced to wear it while sweeping a public latrine. That's a kind of fashion police you don't want to mess with. Historians still argue whether lower status offenders actually faced physical punishment, or if the law relied more on public shaming and asset seizure. But we know that even a rumor of illegally worn purple could trigger an investigation. Tailors could be fined for selling such fabric, and household slaves punished for helping their masters get dressed in it. One senator's ambitious teenage son reportedly dared to dye the hem of his tunic a little darker for his birthday banquet. The result? His father sent him on a month-long modesty tour through the countryside. No sandals, no cloak, just a donkey, and daily lectures from elderly tutors about the dangers of hue-based hubris. And then there's your poor left-handed scribe. You watch as he carefully scratches outlines on a wax tablet, his left hand clumsy against the stylus. In Rome, the left hand sinistra was quite literally sinister, associated with bad omens, foul magic, and just general discomfort. Left-handedness was viewed with suspicion. Children caught writing with their left hand were often forced to switch, or worse, punished as if they were deliberately defying tradition. One punishment involved tying the left arm behind the back for a full day, forcing the child to eat, write, and function entirely with the right hand. The practice was justified under the logic of correcting imbalance, which, frankly, sounds like something a centurion would yell while balancing on a barrel. Fringe theories even suggest some left-handed scribes were assigned menial copying tasks, only lists, menus, nothing creative. The assumption, their perspective was to skew to trust with real ideas. Sounds ridiculous now, but remember, this was a culture that held auspicious bird-watching sessions before major decisions. You pass a statue of Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings. Some say his duality reflected Rome's ambivalence about left and right. Others argue the placement of Janus statues at crossroads helped enforce literal right paths. One tablet, found near a school, includes instructions for correct seating alignment, so as not to favour the cursed side. The cursed side, of course, was left, but punishment wasn't always institutional. It was social, quiet, and relentless. If you reached with your left hand during a banquet, someone might slap it, smiling. If you gestured left while describing a route, people would correct your story with visible discomfort. One orator famous for his wit was mocked so often for gesturing with his left hand that he began using both simultaneously, which just made things worse. The Senate laughed him off the podium. Of course, Rome was inconsistent. Some military formations valued left-handed fighters for surprise tactics. Gladiators trained to use their left side could catch right-handed opponents off guard. So, in the arena, lefty equals deadly. In the library, lefty equals suspicious scroll pirate. Back in the streets, you notice a man being escorted by city guards. He wears a tunic dyed pale violet, not true purple, but close enough to draw scorn. His punishment: he'll spend a day serving water at the baths, but only to those wearing official colours. Yes, even penalties had dress codes. There's also a little-known law involving wedding attire. Brides caught wearing unauthorized colors bright red, saffron, or yes, purple could be fined or forbidden from certain post-wedding rituals. One bride, famous in gossip circles, wore a saffron veil so vivid that senators petitioned to investigate her connections. She ended up exiled not for treason, but for tone. One fringe punishment for both offences, color and handedness, was the circle of correction. Offenders stood in a painted ring in the marketplace for a day, wearing a placard that read, "I confused the order." People threw soft bread rolls at them. Very soft. It was more embarrassing than painful, but you stood there, hour after hour, with seagulls mocking your purple trim and your left-handed grip on the signpost. You pause near a school. A teacher points at a student's stylus and murmurs, "The right hand builds the empire. The left hand scatters it." It's not a quote from Cicero, but it's the kind of thing Rome loved to hear, short, sharp, and vaguely threatening. And still, life went on. People dyed clothes carefully. Children learned to mimic right-handed writing. Scrolls were copied with bland metaphors, and every once in a while, someone risked a little lavender in their hemline, or reached for a pen with the wrong hand, just to see if anyone noticed. You look down at your own hands, glad they're clean, neutral, safe. Then you adjust your tunic ever so slightly, just in case the hem's looking too confident. You hear the splashing before you see it. Unusual, a city like Rome, where most water sticks obediently to aqueducts and baths. This sound is sharper, more urgent, like a fish writhing in a bucket. You follow it, past the crumbling columns and mosaic courtyards, to a small artificial pond ringed with stones. Inside, something stirs beneath the water, long, slick, and sinuous. Eels, not the edible kind, either. These are the terrifying Murray types, sharp-toothed, aggressive, and, for a particular breed of Roman elite, surprisingly handy for punishing the help. You've just found one of the most disturbing corners of Roman cruelty: drowning servants in eel ponds. It sounds like a rumor, a cruel joke passed around by medieval monks trying to make Rome seem worse than it was. But no, ancient sources confirm it. Wealthy Romans, mostly landowners with a flair for dramatics, really did throw disobedient or thieving slaves into pools filled with carnivorous eels. Why? because it was both horrifying and stylish. The most famous account comes from Vettius Pollio, a friend of Emperor Augustus. Pollio kept a pond stocked with flesh-eating eels, supposedly to dispose of slaves who broke his crystal cups. When one poor boy shattered a goblet, Pollio ordered him thrown to the eels. Augustus, who happened to be visiting at the time, was reportedly horrified. He pardoned the boy, smashed the remaining cups himself, and had the eel pond filled in. That's one way to make a point. Historians still argue whether this event was exceptional or indicative of a broader trend among Rome's elite. Some say the story was exaggerated to highlight Augustus's mercy. Others point to archaeological remains of fish ponds and written references to punishment fish as signs that, while rare, this practice wasn't entirely fictional. What's clear is that Romans had a penchant for performative punishment, especially when it involves slaves or lower-class workers. Death wasn't just a sentence. It was a spectacle, and feeding someone to eels. That was equal parts horror and theatre. One senator reportedly invited guests over for wine and poetry, then capped the evening by dropping a servant into his eel tank. Better than mimes, he's said to have joked. Rome's idea of after-dinner entertainment could be intense. You peer into the pond. The eels ripple like shadowy ropes, brushing against one another. One surfaces for a moment, mouth open, revealing tiny, needling teeth. The water bubbles. You instinctively take a step back. It's hard to imagine a person being tossed into that darkness, thrashing until the eels did their work. But that's exactly what happened. Some fringe tales mention eel trials, where a slave's guilt would be judged by whether the eels attacked quickly. If the victim survived for several minutes, it was seen as divine intervention. Spoiler, they rarely survived. There is no evidence this was officially sanctioned law. It reads more like morbid folklore, but in a city where omens decided court cases, it isn't hard to imagine. And eels weren't the only aquatic punishers. In some households, fish ponds were stocked with aggressive lampreys or unusually feisty carp. At least one mosaic shows a figure dangling a small man above a pool labeled justice. Whether symbolic or literal, the message was clear. Misbehavior could end in murky, toothy waters. Rome's obsession with aquatic discipline extended beyond execution. Some children were punished by being made to clean the fish ponds, barefoot braving nips from fish and leeches, not to mention the lingering stench. One text refers to a young scribe who failed to deliver a message and was forced to spend the day submerged up to his neck, reciting legal codes while minnows bumped against his chest. Is it true? Maybe. Is it Roman enough to believe? Absolutely. Of course, not all Romans approved. Seneca the Younger, who had opinions about everything, once wrote that cruelty for cruelty's sake turned a man into a beast. But that didn't stop some of his neighbors from keeping decorative punishment ponds. The logic was twisted. If people saw the consequences of disobedience, they might behave better. It's the same reasoning behind crucifixions along highways. Grim warnings turned into public art. A curious footnote: some nobles, feeling the weight of bad dreams or divine guilt, later freed their eels. One shrine found near a former villa held a carving of a man releasing fish into a river, alongside an inscription that reads, "May they forget what they have eaten." Let's hope the gods agreed. As you turn from the pond, the air feels colder. The eels retreat beneath the surface, as if bored by your lack of wrongdoing. You wonder if their descendants still linger in the Tiber, dark and silent, waiting for another Pollio with a mean streak. But the worst part, it wasn't the eels. It was that someone, somewhere, designed a punishment that was interesting to watch. That's the Roman twist. Make cruelty a conversation starter. You glance over your shoulder one last time. The water is calm now. No bubbles, no splashes. Just the quiet ripple of something very old and very patient, swimming in circles under stone. You take a turn off the main road, and the air thickens not with smoke or spice, but with silence. A still, breathless quiet, the kind that weighs on your skin. Up ahead, a small procession moves slowly through the street. People watch, but they don't jeer. No laughter, no insults. Just long stares and murmured prayers. You follow behind, realizing with a chill that this isn't just another public punishment. This is a funeral, and the woman at its center is very much alive. You re-witnessing one of ancient Rome's most solemn and horrifying sentences, the live burial of a Vestal virgin. Vestal virgins, as you may recall from your less than cheerful Latin classes, were priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Chosen as girls, they served for 30 years, keeping Rome's sacred flame burning and maintaining their vow of chastity. In exchange, they received enormous prestige, the legal status of a man, and a seat at the emperor's table. But if they broke that vow, Rome didn't just revoke their title, they buried them alive. Not immediately. First came a trial, overseen by the Pontifex Maximus. Evidence was rarely concrete whispers, dreams, suspicious glances. Historians still argue whether these trials were based more on politics than fact. A Vestal from the wrong family, or one caught in the middle of a power struggle, might suddenly find herself accused of impurity, which, in this case, meant breaking her vow of chastity. And the punishment had to be symbolic. Killing a Vestal directly was unthinkable. But burying her, that was letting the earth take her back. You trail behind the procession to the Campus Celeratus, the field of wickedness. It's a bland, sun-baked field near the city wall, quiet except for the occasional crow. A tiny underground chamber waits at its center. No sharp stones, no spikes. Just a bed, some food, and a flickering oil lamp. The Romans, ever fond of technicalities, provided basic comforts to claim it wasn't an execution. The woman would simply be left there, sealed in, alone. The last person to see her would be the priest who lowered the final brick. Even the executioner turned away. The crowd does not speak. They know the rules. You can't interrupt this ritual. You can't protest. The priestess was sacred once still is. In a way, and Rome deals with sacred things quietly, even when it's punishing them. One particularly grim case involved a Vestal named Cornelia, who insisted upon her innocence even as she was led to her tomb. She reportedly tripped on her robe during the walk and muttered, "I fall," but not as a guilty one. The Senate still sealed the tomb. Fringe records claim some Vestals may have been buried not for actual impurity, but because they were suspected of harboring secrets. It has been whispered that one priestess tried to expose a corrupt augur, only to be accused herself. Rome had a way of silencing inconvenient voices with ceremony. And while the Vestals were high-ranking, their supposed lovers got no such elaborate ritual. They were usually beaten to death or thrown from the Tarpeian rock. No food, no bed, just gravity and Roman outrage. This punishment was rare, but devastating. Rome didn't bury a woman alive every year. It did it just enough that the fear of it kept everyone silent. Even centuries later, the idea lingered. Early Christian writers mentioned it as proof of pagan cruelty, though some exaggerated the details. You don't need exaggeration when the truth is already this chilling. You might wonder why a city so obsessed with order and law would bury someone alive based on rumor. But Rome's laws were just as political as its punishments. A vestal's fall was a warning, a performance. Even the purest among us can fall, they seem to say, so mind your place. The burial ritual even included symbolic gestures. The food placed in the tomb represented Rome's mercy, the oil lamp its eternal flame. Some say the tombs were made soundproof, so no one could hear the screams. Others claim guards stood by 4 days, just to ensure nothing unusual occurred. Rome respected the dead, but respected its optics more. Notably, not all accused Vestals went quietly. A few appealed their sentences and were acquitted, usually with support from powerful allies. One woman, accused during Emperor Domitian's reign, was spared when multiple witnesses insisted they had seen her fasting and praying during the supposed affair. That case left a mark. The Senate quietly changed how accusations were recorded afterward. You step away from the edge of the field, leaving behind the sunken tomb and the heavy silence. The crowd disperses, each person walking a little slower, a little straighter. No one wants to be seen smirking or whispering, not here. But before you go, you notice something curious. A small, worn statue of Vesta at the edge of the field. Someone has placed a flower in its hand, maybe as a sign of mourning. Or maybe, just maybe, to say we remember. As the sun dips low and the cicadas stir, the field returns to its usual stillness. And you, once a curious outsider, now carry with you the knowledge of a punishment so quiet, so final. It echoes louder than 1,000 lashes. You move along the edge of the forum, where politics, commerce, and religious processions all collide in a noisy, colonnaded jumble. But you're not here for statues or speeches. You're here for a ghost story, the kind only Rome would turn into an annual event. You turn a corner, and there it is, a makeshift platform, a somber altar, and the unmistakable whimper of something leashed and unwilling. The condemned isn't a person this time. It's a dog. You've arrived just in time to witness one of Rome's strangest, most surreal punishments, a ceremonial execution of a dog. Not just any dog, though. This punishment traces its origins to a moment of betrayal, and the city never quite let it go. The story begins with the Gauls' sack of Rome in 390 BCE. According to legend, the sacred geese of Juno alerted the Romans to the Gauls' nighttime assault, honking madly and waking the guards on the Capitoline Hill. The dogs, by contrast, slept through the whole thing lazy, silent, and in the eyes of Romans, shamefully useless. So Rome made a decision that would echo 4 centuries. Every year, they would publicly execute a dog in penance for that ancient failure. You watch as the poor animal is paraded through the streets, tied to a cross or nailed to a board. The people don't cheer, but they don't protest either. This is tradition, a reenactment of betrayal. The dog is marched past the temple of Juno, past the Capitoline stairs, then to the Comitium, where the punishment is delivered. It isn't quick. The dog might be thrown into the Tiber, crucified, or in some cases, beaten to death with ceremonial rods. Some accounts say its body was left in the forum as a warning. To whom? That's never clear. And here's the Roman logic twist. At the same ceremony, geese were celebrated, honored, even garlands were draped over their necks. They were fed special grain, carried in decorated baskets, sometimes treated better than senators. Rome adored loyalty, especially when it came in feathered form. Historians still argue whether this yearly ritual was strictly followed or occasionally paused in quieter decades. But multiple sources, Livy, Plutarch, and later Christian chroniclers mention the event with enough grim detail to suggest it wasn't just a one-off. Some scholars believe the punishment became increasingly symbolic, with less actual harm done over time. Others think the ritual was quietly abandoned as Rome moved deeper into the imperial age, but no one knows exactly when the last dog was executed for a 400-year-old mistake. And yet, dogs weren't generally hated in Rome, quite the opposite. Many families kept small hounds as pets, guard dogs roamed villas, and gravestones dedicated to beloved canines are surprisingly common. One reads, "I am grieving, my little friend. I buried you, a companion, and faithful to the end. So why this dog? Why this punishment?" Rome, you begin to realize, was obsessed with maintaining narrative. The city liked to remember its victories, but it loved to punish its failures. By sacrificing one dog each year, they were retelling the story of their greatest humiliation and their miraculous survival. It wasn't about the dog. It was about the city's ability to stay awake. And there were rules. The dog chosen for the ritual had to resemble the watchdogs of antiquity: large, short-haired, preferably brown. No poodles or lapdogs for this grim parade. The animal was sometimes dressed in a red cloth to mark its guilt, and guards accompanied the procession to ensure no one interfered. Fringe accounts even suggest that in certain years, 2 dogs were punished, one for sleeping and one for not barking. Because in Rome, there's always room for doubling down. You hear someone beside you whisper, "That dog knew what it did." It's a joke, probably, but the tone is serious. The crowd disperses slowly. Some people toss a coin near the platform, not as a bribe or protest, but as a ritual nod to the gods. Justice has been performed, however strange its form. Nearby, a goose waddles in a small pen. It pecks at a fig, oblivious to its role as national hero. Someone's child runs up and squeals with delight. The goose honks once, satisfied, as if saying, "You're welcome, Rome." This isn't the only example of animals facing punishment in ancient Rome. In certain rural courts, pigs were tried for knocking over sacred altars, goats for eating temple scrolls, and once a donkey for kicking a statue of Minerva. Most were acquitted, but some, especially if the damage was symbolic, were punished. The logic: animals, like men, could offend the gods. You might be wondering, did anyone ever protest the annual dog execution? Surely someone. There's a story, half myth, half history, of a young Vestal who tried to interrupt the ceremony, claiming she received a vision from Vesta that the dog had already paid. She was dismissed and fined, though not buried, thankfully. No one wanted to disrupt Rome's rituals, no matter how outdated they seemed, and so the ritual lingered. A dog marched, a goose praised, and the whole of Rome reminded, never sleep on duty. Never forget the one time someone else failed. It's the Roman version of those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, only with more feathers and fewer legal appeals. As you drift away from the Comitium, the noise of the city returns. Street vendors shout, beggars plead, a lyre player strums something that might be a funeral tune. Life moves forward. But in that quiet space between ceremonies, you can almost hear the faint scrape of claws on stone, the echo of a city punishing silence with noise. You pull your cloak tighter and walk on, grateful that, tonight, you're not the one being remembered. You find yourself weaving through a quieter, slightly neglected part of the city. The buildings lean inward, casting deep shadows, and the cobblestones are cracked, probably not visited by senators or sacred geese. You pause at what looks like a temporary tribunal, a wooden platform and a few benches set up in a dusty plaza. At first, it seems like a standard local court. A thief, maybe, a drunkard. But as you settle in among the few spectators, something is clearly off. The accused is not a man, or a woman, or even an animal. It's a chair. Yes, Urine, now attending one of ancient Rome's most bizarre and strangely common rituals, mock trials for inanimate objects. Doors, statues, and yes, even furniture, were summoned to court when involved in serious offences. A child dies under a collapsed arch. The arch is tried. A statue falls during a storm and crushes a senator's pet. The statue faces charges. Logic, optional. At first glance, it seems theatrical, maybe symbolic, but this wasn't just dramatic flair. Rome genuinely believed that justice extended beyond the human realm. Inanimate objects, particularly those connected to death, betrayal, or sacrilege, were subject to secretio ritual condemnation and banishment. In today's courtrooms, you argue over property. In ancient Rome, property itself stood trial. You watch as a magistrate questions witnesses. They're debating whether the door in question, yes, the door was faulty, or if the builder should bear the blame. But the trial is focused entirely on the object. The craftsman isn't even present. This isn't about engineering. It's about cosmic balance. If a man dies unexpectedly, the universe has been nudged out of line. Something must be held responsible. Historians still argue whether these trials were legally binding or primarily ceremonial. Some scholars claim they stem from older Etruscan beliefs about ritual cleansing. Others think it was a practical way to clear cursed objects from public view without admitting political fault. Either way, these mock trials were often accompanied by public rituals, sprinkling of salt, symbolic testimonies, and final sentencing. One case recorded in a surviving legal text involved a beam that fell from a temple roof, killing a priest during a festival. The beam was removed, placed on a cart, and exiled from the city, dragged to a cliff, and tossed into the sea. No word on how the cart felt about its complicity. Even more surreal, certain objects were executed. A stone that crushed a senator's foot was not only removed, but ceremonially beheaded, struck with a sword 3 times before being buried under a pile of leaves. Did this fix the problem? Probably not, but the city felt better. You may laugh, but remember, modern legal systems still have traces of this thinking. We indict corporations, we seize possessions. The Romans just took the idea a step further and added costumes. Some objects, like statues, had even greater legal exposure. If a statue toppled over without clear cause, it might be interrogated by augurs, a bad omen, a sign of divine anger. If the statue fell on someone, that was even worse. Now the gods were involved. One statue of Mercury, reportedly involved in a fatal accident, was tried, found guilty, and melted down. The molten bronze was poured into a sewer as a final insult. Fringe accounts include a grain silo that collapsed during a drought and was accused of betraying the city. That one ended with a bonfire and several priests muttering apologies to Ceres. We don't know if the silo was properly repentant. The most famous case, the trial of the plough. A farmer's son was crushed by a runaway plough during a festival. The plough, still attached to the yoke, was brought before a tribunal, sentenced to death, and ceremonially disassembled. Its wooden frame was burned. Its metal blade, oddly enough, was melted and refashioned into a ritual dagger. Recycling, Roman style. You glance around the tribunal. The crowd is small, but attentive. A few nod solemnly as the magistrate passes sentence, exile. The chair is lifted, slowly, as if it might protest. It's carried down a narrow alley toward the Tiber. No procession, no music, just the soft creak of wood on cobblestone. Somewhere, a dog barks in the distance, as if to say, not again. But this isn't just superstition. To Romans, everything had weight: spiritual, moral, legal. A city that could be felled by disrespecting the gods had to keep all elements in balance. Blame wasn't about logic. It was about ritual closure. You pass a niche with a small inscription. Let the door not betray us again. It's dedicated, apparently, to the memory of a household threshold that once failed to keep burglars out. Instead of replacing it, they punished it. Seems extreme until you remember that these people crucified dogs and buried virgins for Romans. There's even a tale, clearly fringe, and probably fabricated by a bored scribe, of a ladle being blamed for soup poisoning during a banquet. The ladle was confiscated and ritually drowned in wine, then buried with a warning: do not stir again. You leave the tribunal plaza behind, still unsure whether you just witnessed justice or pantomime, or perhaps both. The Romans rarely separated law from theatre. As the sun slips lower, casting long shadows on crumbling walls, you realize Rome didn't just punish the guilty, it punished symbols, objects, animals, colors, gestures. Anything that could hold meaning could also be made to suffer. And in that suffering, Rome found peace, at least until the next door misbehaved. You stroll past the scent of fresh bread, wafting from a side alley, your stomach growling despite the grim parade of punishments you've witnessed tonight. Rome may be cruel, but it is, above all things, consistent, especially when it comes to food. And when food laws are broken, the consequences are often as bizarre as they are flour-dusted. Ahead, you spot a small crowd gathered around a humble storefront, a bakery. A rather unhappy baker stands chained to the doorframe, hands loosely manacled, while nearby officials inspect a fresh stack of loaves. His punishment isn't death, or exile, or even a fine. No, he's being publicly displayed, shamed not for poisoning anyone or starting a riot, but for one of Rome's pet peeves: cheating the weight of bread. Yes, bread fraud. In a city where grain was both currency and lifeline, messing with loaves wasn't just dishonest, it was treasonous to the spirit of Rome. The Annona, the Roman grain dole, supplied wheat to citizens, ensuring that no matter your status, you'd never go without bread. And because of that guarantee, the rules were strict. Bakers were expected to produce loaves of exact weight and shape, often regulated down to the ounce. Skimp on flour, and you might as well spit on the emperor's sandals. The baker you're watching now likely caught selling underweight loaves, or loaves that were falsely labeled state grain. That's a serious charge, a magistrate reads from a tablet as the crowd mumbles and squints. One woman, probably a regular customer, shakes her head in disgust. The baker tries to look apologetic, but there's dough in his beard and desperation in his eyes. The punishment is part humiliation, part deterrent. Being chained to your own shop, in full view of your neighbors, sends a very clear message. This man thought your hunger was negotiable. Historians still argue about how common these punishments were. Some say the chaining was a rare public spectacle. Others think it happened more often in smaller neighborhoods, where food regulation was enforced with an iron spoon. Roman laws about bread were unusually detailed. Bakers were forbidden from producing fancy shapes, using illegal additives, looking at you, sawdust, or charging extra for presentation. You made the bread, you sold it for a set price, and if the weight was wrong even a little, you'd hear about it. One law, etched into a wall in Ostia, states, "Let him who cheats the scale be made to stand before his oven until it forgets him. Poetic, yes. Comfortable, no. Some punishments included shackling the baker inside the bakery, sometimes during peak baking hours, so he'd be forced to work while humiliated. And if you think the bakers were only punished for skimping, think again. Even too much bread could be suspicious. In times of famine, giving out overly generous loaves might seem charitable, but it could be interpreted as harding or bribery. One overly generous baker during a grain shortage was accused of trying to feed the mob into loyalty. He was sentenced to a month of forced labor at the mills, and his loaves were confiscated and redistributed with little signs saying corrected for the public. The fringe punishments get even weirder. One scroll mentions a baker whose loaves were so consistently misshapen that officials made him wear a giant, crusty bread hat in the forum for a day. Was this satire, performance art, official policy? With Rome, it's sometimes all three. You glance at the shackled baker again. He's being pelted not with stones, thankfully, but with crusty leftovers. Children throw stale heel pieces at his feet. A dog sniffs a burned roll and walks away with judgmental dignity. Somewhere nearby, a town crier announces that the loaves of Titus Androcles are hereby condemned. The crowd nods like they're watching a minor legal drama, which, in fact, they are. Behind him, the baker's apprentices continue working carefully, diligently, under the sharp eye of a grain official. The bread they pull from the ovens today will be weighed 3 times before it's sold. Nobody wants to follow their master into the shame shackles. You can't help but wonder, why the obsession? Why bread? Because bread wasn't just food. It was politics. Control the grain, and you control the people. Keep the bread fair, and you keep the mob quiet. That's why the emperor subsidized it. That's why bakeries were closely monitored. And that's why the punishment for cheating bread buyers was, ironically, baked into the very heart of Roman civic life. Even the tools of the trade were watched. Weights and measures were stored in temples. Priests blessed scales. Grain inspectors took oaths before inspecting flour shipments. If your weight stone was found to be hollow or rigged, it might be smashed in public, sometimes with ceremonial hammers, wielded by angry officials wearing aprons. You laugh, but it happened, and God's help you if you shorted the military. Grain fraud against the legion was a one-way ticket to forced conscription or worse. There's a tale of a baker who sends undercooked loaves to a Roman garrison in Gaul. The commanding officer had him lashed and made to eat one of his own gummy creations. The moral: don't feed the army half-baked carbs. As the sun sets, the shackled baker is finally released, rubbing his wrists and slinking back into his shop. But his reputation won't be so easily unchained. For weeks, maybe months, customers will glance suspiciously at his scale, squeeze his loaves with passive-aggressive pressure, and maybe, just maybe, walk a little farther to the next bakery. Just in case, you continue on, your stomach still growling, but you feel oddly reassured. In a city known for public executions and eel ponds, it's comforting to know that even something as simple as underweight bread could bring down a world of public consequences. Rome may be ruthless, but when it comes to bread, it's truly uncompromising. You follow the scent of roasted meat and spilled wine to the outer edges of Rome's more raucous neighborhoods, places where dice rattle louder than prayers and debts rise faster than aqueducts. Here, the taverns are crowded, the air thick with sweat and smoke, and laughter comes with a nervous edge. You've stepped into the domain of gamblers, drunks, and minor troublemakers. But tonight, you're not here for a fight or a wager. You're here to meet someone who rolled the dice and lost not in the game, But in the courtroom, your eyes settle on a lean, bruised man dragging his feet past the amphir-lined walls of a public square. His wrists are loosely bound with cord, and around his neck hangs a wooden sign, Ludens Damnatus condemned for gambling. He is being escorted by 2 guards toward a place you wouldn't expect, a gladiator school. Yes, for certain crimes in ancient Rome, punishment came not in the form of fines or exile, but forced conscription into the Ludus Gladiatorius gladiator training camp. Even if you'd never held a sword in your life, even if your worst offense was losing too loudly at dice, you watch as the gates open with a groan and the man disappears inside. The smell of sweat, blood, and sand drifts towards you. Somewhere beyond those walls, men are learning how to kill, or at least not die in front of a crowd. Historians still debate how often this sentence was handed down. It wasn't for high treason or murder that earned you the arena straight away. This was for lesser crimes, unpaid debts, disorderly conduct, repeated fraud. Gamblers, in particular, were prime targets. Rome hated gambling in theory and tolerated it in practice. But if you caused too much trouble or owed the wrong person money, your punishment might come with a helmet and a trident. One case mentions a man named Felix, a dice hustler who cheated a minor noble during Saturnalia. Instead of prison, he was handed over to a gladiator school for 6 months. The idea wasn't he necessarily to make him a star of the Colosseum, it was to break him. The training was brutal, food was minimal, humiliation was constant, and survival optional. In fact, this sentence had a name: damnatio ad ludum, condemnation to the school. Not to the arena, necessarily, just to the training. Some survived and were released after serving their time. Others didn't make it past day 3, and it wasn't just gamblers. Chronic debtors, those who borrowed beyond their means and refused to pay, were sometimes sentenced to the ludus as well, especially if they borrowed from someone influential. Think of it as debtor's prison meets blood sport. You couldn't pay with coin, so you paid in sweat and bruises. You peer through a crack in the wall. Inside, men circle each other in the dirt, wooden swords clashing, sweat flinging off their bodies like rain. A trainer bellows, again. One man collapses, clutching his side. No one helps him up. The man you saw earlier stands to the side, watching, still holding his sign. His hands shake. Not all damnati ad ludum were treated equally. Those with higher status or connections might be spared the worst drills. One notorious tax evader, sentenced to gladiator school, reportedly bribed his way into kitchen duty instead of swordplay. Others weren't so lucky. A baker who repeatedly sold diluted wine to soldiers ended up serving as a living target during morning spear drills. His punishment: survive until lunch. Fringe stories even mention people faking minor crimes just to get into gladiator school. Why? Fame. The arena was the Roman version of celebrity. Survive long enough, and you could earn freedom, sponsorship, and even marriage proposals. One record tells of a nobleman's son who staged a theft just to be sentenced to the ludus. He wanted to become legend. He lasted 5 days, got hit with a wooden club, and never woke up. But most people sentenced to the school never reached the arena. That was part of the punishment. The promise of something greater dangled just out of reach. You're not a gladiator, you're almost one. And in Rome, being almost something is often worse than being nothing. The legal wording in some sentencing tablets is coldly specific: to serve under the discipline of the blade, without promise of coin or mercy, until death or pardon. It doesn't get much clearer than that. You keep walking and pass a graffiti-covered wall with a crude drawing of a man holding a sword, tears streaming down his face. The caption reads, "Dice gave me iron. Simple, tragic, and very Roman." You wonder what became of men like that. Some, no doubt, died within days, broken bones, heat stroke, or fights gone too far. Others became servants within the school, never touching a sword again, but never allowed to leave. A few did survive long enough to fight in small shows, and even fewer bought or earned their freedom. But the odds, not in your favor. The worst part, Rome loved it. The public adored seeing someone punished with the possibility of greatness. He once stole bread, they'd say, and now he fights lions. Isn't justice beautiful? You shake your head and move away from the ludus. The clang of wood on metal fades behind you. Somewhere inside, a man once accused of shouting too loud over a dice game, wonders if he lions live to see another sunrise. Rome didn't always need blood. Sometimes it just needed the threat of it. You follow a winding road that slopes gently down toward the Tiber River. The air smells faintly of damp stone and fish, and for a moment, things seem almost peaceful. But as you reach a wide clearing near a dock, you see something that brings a chill to your bones. A large sack made of coarse leather, resting ominously near the water's edge. Beside it, for animals pacing crates, tethered, restless, and clearly unhappy. A monkey, a snake, a dog, and a rooster. You've arrived at one of ancient Rome's most infamous and grotesque punishments, pona culle, the penalty of the sack. This wasn't for common crimes like theft or gambling. No, this was Rome's chosen sentence for one of the gravest offenses, parricide, the murder of a parent. Romans believed that killing one's own father or mother was an offense so unnatural, so repulsive, it corrupted the very order of the world. And so they devised a punishment that was as theatrical as it was symbolic. The condemned would be sewn into a leather sack along with 4 animals, then tossed into the river to drown. The logic, peculiar, but deliberate. Each animal symbolized something. The monkey, human mockery. The snake, treachery. The dog, domestic betrayal. The rooster, a perversion of daily cycles, light turned to dark. Altogether, they created a chaotic, biting, flailing menagerie that mirrored the chaos of murdering one's own blood. You watch as the officials prepare the sentence. The condemned man stands with his head down, already wrapped tightly in a coarse tunic. There is no crowd cheering, no laughter. This punishment isn't meant to entertain. It's meant to disturb. Historians still debate how often pona culle was actually carried out. Some say it was rare, more myth than method. Others argue it was used consistently in certain provinces and periods, especially under emperors who leaned heavily into spectacle and symbolism. What's certain is that the sentence appears in multiple legal codes spelled out in detail, almost as if the horror was part of the deterrent. In earlier versions, the condemned was merely tossed into the river in a sack alone. But as time passed, the punishment became increasingly elaborate. One text from the reign of Hadrian describes the animals being carefully selected for discord, meaning they were chosen just for symbolism, but for how incompatible they were inside the sack. You weren't just drowning, you were being bitten, clawed, pecked, and hissed at on the way down. And before the sack was sewn shut, a priest would sometimes perform a final curse, declaring that the condemned was to be cut off from earth, air, and fire, given only water and beasts. The ritual sounds theatrical, but in Rome, theatre and law often held hands. There's a grim account of a young man accused of poisoning his father for inheritance. His trial lasted 3 days. But the sentence was swift. He was sewn into the sack, and as they carried him to the river, witnesses claimed he was screaming not for mercy, but to be thrown in alone. He begged them to remove the animals. They did not. The river accepted the sack with a splash and a gurgle. No tomb, no record, no name chiseled into marble. Parricides were meant to vanish erased not only from the family, but from the memory of the city. One fringe variation, likely apocryphal, involves substituting the monkey for a wild cat when monkeys weren't available. Another account describes an especially theatrical governor ordering musicians to play while the sack was carried through town, so the city might never forget its sacred laws. Most likely, that governor was unpopular at parties. And here's something even darker. Some legal records mention children accusing their parents of parricide, inverting the entire crime. Whether those claims were true or simply part of inheritance battles remains unclear. Rome's family dynamics were often more about property than affection. You look back at the sack. It's being hoisted now, swaying slightly as the animals writhe and make strange, panicked noises. The dog howls, the monkey screeches, the man inside the sack says nothing. There's a splash, sudden and final. The surface bubbles for a moment, then settles. No applause, no public mourning. Just the soft lapping of the Tiber against stone. The officials pack up the crates, now empty, and walk away. The site is already being cleared, as if nothing happened. You might wonder why not just execute the criminal in a more efficient way. The answer is the same as always in Rome. Punishment was about symbolism, not speed. The crime of parricide shattered the natural order, so the punishment had to be something beyond mere death. It had to be unnatural. A man sealed in a bag with beasts, denied the dignity of a grave, was Rome's ultimate way of saying, "This cannot be forgiven." Later, you pass a small shrine near the forum with a carved relief of a snake curled around a sack. The inscription reads, "For the blood that forgot its source." Even in stone, the message lingers. You move on quickly, suddenly eager to be among crowds, noises, people. Rome's punishments sometimes had a silence to them, a stillness more haunting than screams. Tonight, you're grateful to have solid ground under your feet, and no sack in sight. You ease back into Rome's busiest streets, grateful for the sound of voices, the smells of roasting garlic, the blur of everyday life returning to normal. But don't get too comfortable. Ahead, near a modest family tomb and a stand selling reeds, you spot another scene unfolding, a quiet gathering, but tense. A funeral, a Roman one, and you're just in time for the punishment. It's not aimed at the dead, it's for the living. Specifically, the mourners. You've stumbled into the world of professional mourners, and tonight, one of them is in trouble for crying too much. Yes, in ancient Rome, even grief came with regulations, and if you overdid it, wailed too loudly, tore your clothes too dramatically, or just made too theatrical a show of sadness, you could be fined, removed from the site, or banned from future funerals. In some cases, professional mourners were even whipped in private for drawing too much attention. The logic, as always in Rome, grief was a public performance, but one that had to stay within strict limits. Death was sacred, mourning was ritualized. Anything outside the approved emotional parameters was considered a threat to dignity and order. You watch now as a woman, draped in deep blue, collapses in front of a funeral bier, sobbing and clawing at her cheeks. A few onlookers nod, moved. But one older man, a funeral overseer, rose his eyes. He gestures to two attendants. They approach the woman, whispering urgently. She sobs louder. One of them lifts her by the elbow, not gently. Historians still argue whether mourners were truly punished on the spot, or if fines were levied later. What's clear is that excess was not welcome. Rome had a fear of losing control over crowds, over emotions, over women in particular. Professional mourners, known as praeficae, were mostly women hired to start the weeping. They sang dirges, tore their hair, and sometimes even scratched their faces bloody. It was their job to amplify grief, but not upstage it. One surviving law reads, "Let not the mourner's voice rise above that of the kin." If you made the widow look emotionally minor, you were out of line, and yes, there were actual penalties. One praefica was reportedly banned from the forum for 6 months after performing an overly elaborate dirge for a wealthy merchantess wife. Another was fined for using musical instruments during a mourning procession, considered garish and disrespectful. Romans wanted solemnity, not a traveling concert. You might be thinking, but didn't Rome love drama? Yes, but controlled drama, state drama. Funerals were civic events. A family's grief reflected its values, its class, and its discipline. Too much crying suggested chaos. And chaos, to Rome, was contagious. Fringe punishments, plenty. One overzealous mourner, who reportedly faked fainting during 6 different funerals, was forced to spend a day lying on a bier herself, without food or water as correction. Another, caught sneaking into funerals for free bread and wine, was paraded through the market with a crown of onion peels and a sign that read, "Weeps for coin, not soul." And then there is the curious case of the laughing mourner, a woman who was paid to cry at a senator's funeral, but was caught giggling with a cousin during the wine break. She claimed she was remembering something sweet. The family claimed she mocked the dead. She was sentenced to recite the deceased's virtues aloud at the next public festival, a kind of grief penance, under the hot sun, with no wine. But professional mourning wasn't just for show. It helped stir public sentiment, which in turn elevated the dead's memory. A bigger, louder funeral meant a more important person. That's why so many families wanted the drama. They just didn't want it to go rogue. You glance back. The woman has been escorted to a corner. Her cry is now silent. The overseer nods to the rest of the mourners to proceed. The bier is lifted. The dirge resumes, this time, quieter. Interestingly, elite families sometimes kept lists of preferred mourners. These women knew exactly how loud to cry, when to fall, how to modulate their voice depending on the status of the deceased. Training existed. Etiquette, too. One instructional text advised mourners not to begin crying until the eldest male nods. There were even competitive mourners, women who claimed to weep more convincingly than others. Think of them as grief influencers. One account describes a feud between two praeficae who competed at funerals by outwailing each other, until a magistrate intervened and declared a mourning quota for both, and the clothes also regulated. Some mourners wore deep grey or dull purple veils, but wearing pure black reserved for close kin could get you scolded or removed. One overstepping mourner was allegedly stripped of her black veil in the middle of a funeral by the widow herself, who shouted, "Your sadness is not deeper than mine." Afterward, she was banned from mourning in that district for a year. And then, of course, came the expectations of silence. Rome allowed loud mourning during processions and at the tomb, but not in temples, not in markets, and not during the sacred Parentalia festival. A mourner who forgot this rule and began howling in front of a bakery was fined and made to donate grain for temple rites. Poetic justice in carved form. You step back as the procession moves toward the family tomb. A few mourners sniffle quietly. One child waves a laurel branch. The air is heavy, but respectful. The punished prefecture sits alone now, dabbing her eyes with a dirty sleeve. No guards, no shackles. Just a different kind of exile, the kind that comes from crying a little too well. In a city that measured everything, even emotion, it turns out your tears could be taxed, timed, and, when necessary, punished. You walk away, the soft dirge fading behind you. Rome never lacked sympathy. It just preferred it came with a receipt. The streets are thinner now, winding through neighborhoods where public fountains gurgle and neighbors gossip from windows strung with drying tunics. You pass a bathhouse with steam curling lazily from its roof tiles and find yourself in front of an unassuming public latrine, stone benches, evenly spaced holes, and a long, open channel of running water beneath. It's quiet, but not abandoned. A few citizens come and go, robes lifted just enough, sandals squeaking. And as mundane as it looks, this latrine has seen its fair share of drama. Because here, deep in the underbelly of Rome's everyday life, lurks one of the oddest and most overlooked punishments in the empire's history: toilet sponge theft. You approach the entrance and see a bored-looking guard standing beside a small display of objects confiscated that week. A coin purse, a chipped wine cup, and yes, a used sponge on a stick. Rome had no toilet paper. Instead, public toilets offered communal sponges affixed to wooden rods, soaked in water or vinegar. You'd use one, rinse it if you were polite, and leave it for the next person. Sharing, in this context, was not optional, it was civic hygiene. But what if someone decided to take one? That's where things got weird. Theft of a tesorium, that's the name for the sponge stick, wasn't just disgusting. It was disruptive. These were public utilities, maintained by tax money and meant to serve dozens of citizens a day. Remove one, and you broke the chain of dignity. You disrespected Rome's hygiene machine. Punishment for this wasn't always harsh, but it was uniquely humiliating. Some thieves were forced to carry a replacement tesorium around their neck for a day, like a shame medal. Others had their heads or arms shaved in public, the sponge held aloft by a town crier as a kind of symbolic. This man dirtied the commons announcement. Historians still debate whether these punishments were official law or just enforced by local magistrates in search of order and entertainment. One surviving inscription near a latrine warns, "He who removes the sponge shall return it, or be marked unclean." No fine, no jail, just social exile. But sponge-related infractions weren't limited to theft. There's the matter of improper use. One man, according to fringe records, was caught using the communal sponge to wash his feet. The result? Public flogging and temporary banishment from all bathhouses within the city walls. You have to respect the thoroughness. Another punishment, detailed on a wall painting near Pompeii, involved tying the sponge thief to the latrine bench for several hours during peak use. Not dangerous, but extremely embarrassing, especially when passers-by were encouraged to guess the thief's name aloud. One could argue it was the Roman version of a very public comment section. You notice a small boy being scolded by an elderly man near the latrine entrance. The boy appears to have taken to sponge sticks, perhaps for mischief, perhaps as a dare. The man waves his cane, shouting about dishonor and unwashed hands. The boy retreats, leaving the sticks behind, red-faced and wiser. The tesorium itself was treated with surprising reverence. Latrines often featured shelves or cubby holes for storing them properly. Some wealthier individuals carried personal versions, wrapped in linen, monogrammed even, but public ones, those were communal property, and stealing one was as much an insult to the city as it was to the next poor soul in line. One odd legal document from the reign of Domitian mentions a man fined for offering spoiled sponge to a fellow citizen. The details are unclear, but the implication is grotesque. Sponges could be weaponized. In this case, the punishment was equally creative. The offender was ordered to clean 12 sponge sticks by hand under the supervision of a bathhouse priest. And yes, that's a job. Even weirder. In one infamous case, a politician allegedly placed perfumed sponges in a public toilet to curry favor with voters. His opponents cried foul, claiming it was bribery in its most base form. The case was dismissed, but not before earning him the nickname Consul Softbottom. And then there's the curious matter of sponge hoarding. In times of plague or festival, when latrines saw heavy use, guards were stationed to monitor sponge supply. One record suggests that families sent servants early in the morning to reserve sponges by tying ribbon to the handles. When these ribbons were found en masse and linked to a senator's household, it caused a minor scandal. The family was fined, and the senator had to issue a very formal apology. Toilet politics at its finest. You take a seat on a bench not far from the entrance. The stream of users continues, each emerging with varying expressions of relief, annoyance, or deep thought. Romans, after all, believed the latrine was a place for conversation. Some even had philosophical debates mid-squat. Cicero himself once joked that more truths are passed beneath us than above us. As you sit, you notice a faded carving on the latrine wall. He who soils the sponge shall sit in shame. Another says simply, I cleaned it. You're welcome. You smile. Romans were dramatic, sure, but they also understood the small indignities of shared living, and they found ways to make even the pettiest crimes a public lesson. As the sky darkens and lanterns flicker to life, the latrine remains busy. Life, after all, continues no matter the time, the place, or the quality of the communal sponge. You rise, grateful not just for cleanliness, but for anonymity. Because in ancient Rome, even a missing sponge could make you famous. You drift through Rome's bustling center again, passing taverns, temples, untorchlit courtyards, until the sounds change. It's subtle at first: cheers, music, the rhythmic thump of drum beats, but soon they crescendo into something unmistakably theatrical. You follow the noise to a packed open-air theater near the Field of Mars. Tonight's performance is well underway, and the crowd roars with approval. At first glance, this seems like a regular Roman spectacle: costumed actors, elaborate props, a slightly absurd mythological plot. But as you settle into the edge of the crowd, you realize this is no ordinary play. This is one of Rome's most chilling punishments: execution by theater. Yes, you heard that right. In some Roman stage productions, the deaths were real. Condemned criminals, often those guilty of murder, rape, or treason, were forced to participate in theatrical performances where their character as scripted death was carried out literally. There were no props, no tricks, and no mercy. Just the stage, the audience, and the final act. You look up just as a figure costumed as Icarus takes center stage. He wears waxen wings, feathers clinging to his arms, and a crown of brittle sunbursts. The crowd cheers as he climbs a tall platform, reciting lines about ambition and divine wrath. And then, without flourish or hesitation, he's pushed. There's no net. A sickening silence follows. Then thunderous applause. The man on stage was not an actor. He was a prisoner, condemned and told he'd play the part of Icarus for one final show. And the waxen wings, just costume dressing. His fate was never about theatre, it was about message. Historians still argue how widespread this practice was. Some say it was rare, a curiosity of the imperial court. Others suggest it became more frequent under emperors like Nero and Domitian, who blurred the lines between art and punishment. But we know it happened. Roman writers like Suetonius and Martial mention theatrical deaths as public entertainment, part execution, part cautionary tale, part twisted spectacle. One infamous example is a retelling of the myth of Orpheus. In this version, Orpheus is played by a condemned man. Instead of being saved by his music, he's mauled by live animals on stage, bears or leopards, depending on the version. The crowd was told the animals were trained. They weren't. You glance around and notice how little anyone seems disturbed. The crowd eats, drinks, laughs. The death you just witnessed has already folded into the evening's entertainment. Someone jokes that tomorrow they'll do the story of Hercules. You wonder if the Hercules they've chosen knows how it ends. In some cases, criminals were cast in elaborate mythological tales. Pyramus and Thisbe, Prometheus, Attis, where death wasn't just expected, it was thematically necessary. And Rome, ever devoted to symbolism, saw this as poetic justice. You killed a man, then you'll be a man slain on stage, and everyone will clap. One fringe account tells of a man who was sentenced to die as a tree spirit in a woodland scene. The execution, tied to a post, covered in pitch, and set alight during a mock forest fire. The audience was told it represented divine cleansing. The executioner called it lighting the understudy. You hear someone behind you mention a new production being planned for next week, a retelling of the myth of Marsyas, the satyr who challenged Apollo and was flayed alive. You don't ask who's been cast. You already know the answer. The performers in these gruesome roles were often promised freedom if they survived, but few ever did. The nature of the roles, falling, burning, being crushed or mauled, made survival nearly impossible. One account suggests that occasionally a prisoner might be spared after a particularly convincing performance, but these stories are hazy, more hope than history. Of course, not every theatrical execution involved gods and myths. Some were simple reenactments of crimes. A thief might be caught mid-performance by actors playing guards, then publicly beaten or hanged during the finale. The twist: the audience rarely knew what was real. Rome, ever dramatic, reveled in this confusion. Is it theatre? Is it justice? Does it matter? You look back to the stage. The next act begins. A man dressed as Daedalus runs frantically across the boards, searching for his son. But there's no body to retrieve. The actor, performer who played Icarus, has already been removed. There's nothing left but feathers. The theatre guard near you chats with a patron. Better than the last show, he says. At least this one fell straight. The idea that a human life could be reduced to a plot device feels deeply unsettling. But for Rome, it made perfect sense. Execution by theatre was efficient, symbolic, and profitable. Tickets sold, lessons were learned, myths were kept alive, and justice, in its blood-soaked way, was served. Some emperors turned these shows into grand festivals. Nero famously opened his private gardens for plays featuring condemned prisoners, many of whom died spectacularly, for crowds of senators, soldiers, and slaves. He reportedly composed verses about their deaths in real time. A kind of poetry slam, with execution as punctuation. You might wonder whether the victims were ever allowed to rehearse. Some were, briefly. Others weren't told what the twist ending would be. A sword that was supposed to be dulled wasn't. A stage that was only 3 feet high turned out to be 10. The gods demand accuracy, after all, and the audience. They became accomplices, whether they knew it or not. The line between theatre-goer and witness blurred. Rome's justice system wasn't just public, it was participatory. You turn to leave just as another actor steps forward to announce the interlude. The crowd shifts, eager for more wine and gossip. No one speaks of the man who fell. His role is over. His part has been played. The stage is already being reset. As you walk away, you can't help but picture tomorrow's bill posters. Don't he miss Medea? She's got real knives this time. Rome, as always, doesn't waste a single opportunity to turn punishment into performance. You take one last turn, following the gently curving cobblestones past a series of upper-class homes whose gardens spill with lavender and laurel. You're expecting peace here, quiet punishment-free luxury, but instead, you arrive at a courtyard buzzing with strange energy. Soft giggles, rustling feathers, and the sound of someone pleading between bouts of helpless laughter. You've reached the oddest corner of Rome's punishment archives, a place where pain isn't always blood and bruises. Sometimes, Rome's justice came with feathers. Welcome to the strange world of imperial tickling, feather torment, and ceremonial humiliation. You peer through a low colonnade and see a man lying on a marble bench, his ankles bound, his tunic hiked indecorously above his knees. To attendants grinning run long, soft feathers across the soles of his feet. The man rides, laughs, bakes. This isn't entertainment for a crowd. It's a punishment. But it's also funny. And that's exactly the point. Romans had a long history of associating shame with discomfort, especially discomfort that looked harmless. Tickling, yes, actual tickling was sometimes employed as a soft-form sentence for minor offences, mostly among nobles, poets, or court jesters who'd insulted the wrong person but didn't quite deserve a whipping, or, as one senator put it, for when a man must learn a lesson, but not bleed for it. Feather torture often took place in private estates, not prisons. Think, imperial timeout. A dinner guest who made an off-color joke about the Empress's perfume find himself tied to a couch in the garden and corrected with goose feathers, vinegar on the soles, and endless laughter that soon turned to wheezing desperation. You might laugh until you've had your feet scrubbed raw with a bristle brush dipped in olive oil, followed by feather trails that felt oddly surgical. One account mentions a poet sentenced to 3 bouts of forced mirth for mocking a general's baldness. He couldn't walk for 2 days. And don't think this was all fun and games. Some versions involved extreme tickling combined with foot caning, cold water, or the occasional use of honey smeared on the skin to attract insects. It was psychological warfare disguised as a party trick. Death, rare, but suffering. Oh yes, laughter was just the entrance fee. Historians still debate whether this practice was codified into law or more of an elite custom, a side dish to formal sentencing. Most evidence suggests it was unofficial, but widely tolerated among the upper class. It allowed nobles to punish each other without the mess of blood or scandal, and Rome loved symbolism. Feathers were associated with birds, of course, but also the element of lightness, of words. So feather torment was reserved for those who offended with speech, satirists, gossipers, loud drunk uncles. One account describes a philosopher who mocked a senator's oratory and was sentenced to silent contemplation while being tickled for an hour beneath his toga. The guards reportedly had to mop the floor afterward. A lot. Fringe punishments got weirder. There's a record, possibly exaggerated, of a man sentenced to wear a cloak entirely made of goose feathers for insulting Jupiter's sacred birds. It molted constantly, and citizens were encouraged to pluck feathers when they passed him. He was known, affectionately, as the roaming rooster. And don't forget the golden collars. You see one now shiny, ornamental, deceptively pretty. A man kneels in the center of the courtyard, wearing one that reads, "I kissed where I should not." His crime: stealing a kiss from a priestess's maid. His punishment: a week of feather torment and the gilded humiliation tour. The collar weighs 5 pounds and chafes in the sun. It's not just a joke, it's branding, quite literally. Other collars bore different messages. "I speak too freely," or "My hands wander," or even the classic "I jest, therefore I weep." These phrases weren't only poetic, they served as mobile morality lessons. Walk by, read, judge, remember. You step aside as a young boy tiptoes past carrying a bowl of goose feathers. He giggles and tosses one in your direction. A nearby servant smiles and says, "Best to avoid poetry until the season ends." You wonder, who decides when tickling is the right punishment? Usually, it was up to the magistrate or, more dangerously, the emperor himself. Caligula famously sentenced an entire cohort of drunken guards to a night of pillow tickling after they failed to notice a trespasser at his villa. None of them laughed by the end. Domitian, more cruel, used feather torment on court poets who displeased him. One of them, named Marcus Fulvus, was reportedly driven to temporary madness by 20 straight minutes of coordinated tickling by trained slaves. Fulvus recovered and later wrote a poem about it. It rhymed poorly, but was considered historically accurate. You see another man emerging from the villa, red-faced, clutching his sides. He limps slightly, sandals loose. The guard at the gate says, "That's what he gets for quoting Catullus at the wrong dinner." You nod. Point made. And here's the thing: this form of punishment worked. It humiliated. It didn't permanently injure. And it reminded Rome's elite that no one was above a little indignity. For the common folk, it was a reminder that even senators could be reduced to squirming messes under a goose feather. As you leave the courtyard, you notice a small inscription carved into a column near the gate. "Laughter teaches what silence cannot." It's not wrong. The torchlight softens behind you. The giggles fade, but the lesson lingers. In Rome, not all punishment was cruel. Some of it was just really, really uncomfortable. And now, as the noise of Rome slips into stillness and the city exhales its final sigh for the night, you find yourself walking more slowly. The torchlit courtyards are quiet. The sandals of patrolling guards echo faintly against damp stone. Somewhere, a fountain trickles in the private garden. And even the pigeons, those eternal Rome watchers, have tucked their heads beneath their wings. You've walked the length of the empire's strangest justice, seen noses nailed to walls, eels fed by anger, scrolls tied to ankles, and men sewn into sacks with snakes and chickens. You've passed by burning loaves, tiptoed through feathered courtrooms, and watched laughter turned into a sentence. And now, there's only silence. It hangs in the air like incense, soft, a little bitter, but somehow comforting. Rome was a city of contradictions, order and chaos, law and spectacle, punishment and performance. But beneath all the oddity and cruelty lay a constant truth: every action had meaning. Every sentence had a purpose, even if that purpose was only to remind others to walk the line. As you reach the edge of the forum, the marble stones cool beneath your feet. The statues loom tall and still, their shadows stretched long like ancient memories, watching you go. Nothing chases you now. No drums, no jeers, no feathers. Just breath, just space, just sleep. So rest easy, traveller. No more parades, no more sacks, no more sponge-based justice. Just the hush of a sleeping empire. and the peace that comes from having survived its strangest laws, one odd punishment at a time. Now, close your eyes. Let the world of Rome fade behind you. Let your mind drift where no torch reaches. You've made it through.